I thought I would just begin here by showing you the index page for the World Soundscape Project database, the WSP database, which we make freely available to to people who are interested. All they have to do is send me an email with a request for the guest password, and that is very easy for me to handle. So in fact, the context of this lecture is also, of course, the soundscape tradition, dare I say, which is also approaching nearly 50 years. So everything that I'm presenting today will be found under the HTML documentation, which is my teaching materials. It also has a non-HTML. HTML refers to not just the coding of the website, but the embedded audio. You'll see me using embedded audio, which Safari and Firefox allows you to recognize. Um, the, um, the other aspect I'm going to touch on briefly is the new tutorial. The handbook, of course, is something that's been around for a long time. I started it with the WSP back in the 70s, and it is essentially a collection of terminology. It's a reference book. And over the last year, inspired by the pandemic lockdown and moving online, I created an online tutorial for teaching these subjects, and I'll show you that briefly. But since we've been introducing this with the World Soundscape Project, in case anyone is totally unfamiliar with it, let me just give you a quick tour through the WSP information. Here is it's often called iconic shot of the group. And here is Murray Schafer in 1973 at Simon Fraser University, which is a very modern campus. It was created in 1965. And on the West Coast, it was a kind of, with particularly the environmental emphasis that was starting to happen in the 73, such as Greenpeace that began in Vancouver. We were definitely having a different kind of approach than the traditional one in a very non-traditional university. So basically the opposite of a German university in 1973, if you don't mind my saying so. So this is the group plus Hildegard Westerkamp that was working in the studio that did the field recordings and the heavy equipment, the Negra, and so on and so forth. And you can see typical 1970s look here on the campus. I was very pleased when my students and colleagues reinterpreted the same picture in the same location in 2010, and they call themselves the acoustic crew, right? And they have much more portable equipment and are much better dressed and very fashionable than we were back then. Okay, the recordings themselves, the first was naturally our own Vancouver soundscape. I'm not going to play examples here, but just give you a taste of this. And then if you want to come back and get a guest password, you can go through this on your own. And so the original 1973 recordings were what we now call more documentary or phonographic by analogy to photography. There was, as Leopoldo mentioned, really only editing and transparent mixing that was involved. So beginning with the ocean sounds, a track with our First Nations elder and the language. Also found sort of recordings such as the New Year's Eve recording and other things. The thing that was different compositionally was the entrance to the harbor. So it's one of it features some of what we call sound marks, the sound marks of Vancouver at that time, prominent sounds, signals. So things like the 9 o'clock gun that still goes off at 9 p.m. The O Canada horn is now moved to the harbor, but it was a centennial project in '67. We only have one peal of bells, the Holy Rosary Cathedral, which is the Catholic cathedral here. But the entrance to the harbor, besides the usual sound marks, etc., wanted to have an imaginary journey from the outer harbor here past the foghorn, which is the Point Atkinson diaphone, under the bridge and into the inner harbor and to dock. And so if you were just on a boat doing that, all you would get was the engine noise. So in retrospect, this entrance to the harbor simulated, frankly, rather crudely, we barely had a something you would recognize as a mixer at that point. But crossfading and using the various sounds that were recorded separately, and then constructing a shortened, like 7 minutes, for instance, or 8 minutes, journey into the city. The actual journey, which was possible, would have taken a half an hour. And so it did, in retrospect, it did start to create the sense of composition. On the other hand, there would be, for instance, later recordings, for instance, from 80, 81, where we presented a completely unmodified original recording of an event, such as the New Year's Eve celebrations, where all of the ships in the inner harbor and the horns get sounded in a raucous kind of celebration. It also introduced ideas of acoustic space, the profile of those bells that had shrunk from the early days, and so on. It started integrating this with the history of the city. Those bells, for instance, used to be heard all over the city because in 1920 or so, it was the highest point in the city, whereas now, of course, it's surrounded by tall high rises. In the 1990s, we revisited the recordings. First of all, did more recordings. So we started this longitudinal study of our own city. This was 20 years later, now with digital recording. And now we start seeing invited composers. In fact, two of them were from Germany, Sabine Breitsemeter and Hans-Ulrich Werner. They were associated with the radiophonic tradition in Germany, which was very strong, still is. That was interesting because the artistic community was not very interested in all of this work. Whereas I can say now, after my teaching at the Technical University in Berlin in 2015, 2016, I'm just amazed at how interested everybody is in Soundscape, right? So we've lived long enough to see that whole world sort of change. So there was a documentary in here and so on, but basically we were then at that point dealing more with composition. The Soundscapes of Canada, which came right after the Vancouver, was from a cross-country tour of Canada, very broad country, as you know, and all of the different kinds of approaches to radiophonic work were explored here, from fairly straightforward documentaries about signals and keynotes, or sound marks of Canada, now just extending this. These are two from the East Coast, bells and foghorns. The fairly important recording, though, was the summer solstice, recorded in 1974 on the grounds of a monastery, basically in rural Fraser Valley outside of Vancouver. And that was our first encounter with what is now bioacoustics, because we recorded on the summer solstice in June, the recording. Here's the Niagara being recording around a pond. And so most of the sound was from the pond life, the frogs and birds. And no, we didn't really know those species, actually. But what we heard was a balance between the frogs at night crossfading with the birds in the morning. And at every moment during the 24 hours, there was a constant change in the acoustic balance, but it never lost that balance. Yes, there were some aircraft in the distance. They look prominent here, but in fact, they were kind of background. And so we got a sense of, after having documented the noise problems of Vancouver, in the Vancouver recording, we got a sense of a natural acoustic balance in the bioacoustic habitat. And a few years later, or approximately at the same time, Bernie Krause in California was starting to do recordings, in fact, of natural soundscapes, and eventually reached what's called niche hypothesis about how that balance actually manifests itself in both the frequency domain and the time domain. So that formed an interesting and challenging alternative to the problems of noise in the city. So how could we find a socio-acoustic habitat that could also function as well as the natural one? And of course, both of them are vulnerable to change, to noise, to intrusions. I'll just finish this little survey here with there were some composed pieces as well as documentary pieces, including oral history from the East Coast with the parish priest in Percé, Quebec. And because Canada has that historical, um, uh, in terms of the exploration and settlement from the colonial past, that's very strong on the East and much more recent on the West. This was followed up in 1975 by the European tour that Schaefer did with his some colleagues, not me. I had just come back from Europe, actually, where I was studying, and we studied to try to find an acoustic community other than the cities. They chose 5 villages in different countries, a industrial, fairly modern town in Skruv in Sweden that had factories, but also a very balanced soundscape. In Germany, it was the agricultural town of Bissingen outside Stuttgart that had, of course, all the traditional, bells that went off every 15 minutes, but it also had a 24-hour factory, and it also had aircraft coming from a nearby airplane base. Cembra was in Italy. It was a northern Italian town north of Trento, and it was very much more on the human scale. Lots of voices, lots of activity. It had snowed, but even crazy Italian drivers couldn't go that fast over these streets and around the labyrinth quality, even though they kept trying. So we got a sense of a more human-based soundscape. There in France and Brittany, there was a fishing village in Brittany called L'Esquenil, very much dominated by the activities of the fishing fleet going out and coming back in and auctioning off their catch. In Scotland, there was an academy town, a school, an academy, and plus pipe bands. Of course, we're at a pseudo Scottish University, Simon Fraser. We have a world champion pipe band ourselves. We recognize that, but then here, of course, we could not be deterred by any languages, and there was an oral history or memory walks that were taken with the local town clerk who remembered the oral history of the area. So that's just a brief survey. There's many more things that were involved. The publications that are now online and early recordings. My colleague Hildegard Westerkamp, who you mentioned, who was very instrumental in cataloging the tape library along with Bruce Davis. And she, of course, went on to have her own amazing career as a composer and sound walking specialist. So publications and so on. So as you can see, I won't go through the rest of the database, but you can see that there is a lot of, first of all, the recording collections, all of the recordings, including now ones in 2020 and 2010 in Vancouver. So we have a 40-year longitudinal database. There's a subject index where you can look up sounds by the types and go directly to those recordings. I just want to mention, besides obvious lectures, interviews, video interviews, teaching materials, I just want to mention the tutorial for the handbook that I recently did, as I said, for online teaching. This is not introductory. This is more for, well, I would say 3rd or 4th year or graduate student level. And it covers all of the material that's in the handbook, but from a teaching perspective, and half devoted to the acoustic and the other, the electroacoustic side of studio work. And often these are kept separate, but here, because of links, we put a lot of links back and forth between these modules. And as you can see in the electroacoustic side, after going through a lot of the standard techniques plus some non-standard one, I will be introducing you to convolution and auto-convolution, as well as microsound granular synthesis that, are in fact becoming increasingly of interest to people, but they still are not in the kind of standard, more commercially based area. That composition with voice and text base and of course, inevitably, soundscape composition is part of these modules. So that's more a look at the material that is available if you want to do self-study in this area along with the other aspects of the WSP. So let's go now to soundscape composition. I'm going to give you a little bit of a theoretical overview in a couple of ways, because I have been situating this as an example of the inner and outer complexity with sound references. Generally, music in the past has been taught as an independent study. You might say only inner complexity, sound related only to each other. And in fact, most of the acousmatic tradition that was mentioned does follow that same pattern. Of course, it's obviously expanding now and not becoming polarized in any way, but sounds related to each other is basically the European tradition of classical music and acousmatic music. And so it minimizes the contextual references by recording sound objects, for instance, that are isolated from their acoustic context, whereas the soundscape and soundscape approach is more likely to be talking about sound events and entire soundscape recordings, which of course are challenging to use because of that complexity, are challenged to use compositionally. And there are some interesting issues there. But this particular diagram is trying to point out that the real world complexity in conjunction with the inner complexity. And nowadays, inner complexity involves right down to the microsound level of what's called the time frequency domain, which is less than 50 milliseconds. I'm not going to go into that. I certainly have lots of teaching material about it, but I'm just trying to say, when we say the inner complexity of sound, we go right down to the quantum level today because of digital processing. And in fact, it's almost ironic that some of those techniques then allow us to maximize the outer complexity or relate to the outer complexity. That may seem counterintuitive, but I'm going to try to show examples that do exactly just that. So we try to invoke the knowledge of real world context and the primacy of listening and listeners' processes in dealing with that, as opposed to just assuming a generic listener. A lot of compositional challenges, but I'm going to try to show you how that might work. The next part I'm trying to, well, actually, I'll just put a communicational plug in here. This inner and outer complexity sounds rather abstract, but in fact, it's not, because it's exactly what happens with everyday sound. For instance, this simple model here I'll start with this one at the micro level, that every sound that we hear, we interpret it with two different sources of information. One is its own internal structure at micro level or event or macro level patterns. We recognize structure and we have an understanding of context, the outer complexity. And so when you hear a siren, you, for instance, will recognize because of its pattern, unless it's something new, that what it means. But on the other hand, your knowledge of context, if you're living beside a hospital or a fire station, you'll know that that's not necessarily an emergency, or it's not involving you, or it's not something. You will know what that context means. Or maybe it's just a signal that goes off every day to mark 12 noon or something like that. So your knowledge of context then is something that you almost effortlessly bring until something, new or novel happens in there. So basically, we're always matching inner and outer complexity in the listening process. And I keep coming back to that because listening is often far more discerning and complex than, for instance, what psychoacoustics can tell us. We do need to know about the acoustics and psychoacoustics, and environmental acoustics, hence the tutorial. But on the other hand, we always come back to listening because there's many more levels of meaning that are practiced even with everyday sounds, and it's a constant source of information and inspiration, actually, I was going to say. Now, soundscape composition, I put this on a continuum that I divided here up into two parts. The left-hand part puts phonography that I've mentioned, the more documentary approach, in the middle. This is actually the middle of the continuum here it's certainly not neutral, but it's the area of field recording where a lot of choices are made of how to represent. But often in a phonographic or documentary approach, then transformation is minimized And it's things like transparent editing or mixing that are choices that extend the original choices made by the recordist of what to record, when to record, what microphones, distance, time, everything that all the choices that have been made. So everything, but on the other hand, it tries to be a little more faithful representation without extending it into more manipulation. It's also in the middle because we also have sound mapping called sonification or audification. That's become quite popular in the last few decades of mapping sound data or even the sound waveform itself. That would be audification, but most of it is mapping sound parameters such as frequency or amplitude or something onto mapping real world data onto the sound in those parameters. And so sometimes that is science in the service of art. For instance, if you are trying to communicate about climate change or something like that, as Andrea Pauly, the American sound artist, does, she maps real world data that might have a relationship to in the environmental degradation onto sound installations that communicate better to the public. Or it could be art in the service of science in some way. So it could be sound sculptures, installations, any kind of mapping that goes on. I'm only going to talk about the right-hand side of the continuum that goes from the found sound, the more documentary approach, to virtual or imaginary worlds, or as I also will try to suggest, abstracted worlds that are still related to the real world in some way. And that's where some of the issues that Leopoldo talked about will come up. Particularly that abstracted quality, to me, often goes into the inner world of the listener, the world of metaphor, imagery, imagination, symbolism, so on and so forth. I don't have time to go into the work of many of my colleagues, such as Don Drever, who's asked pertinent questions about the ethnographic aspects of documentation, Greg Wagstaff, involving participants, Stephen Felt, the musicologist, ethnomusicologist, who's emphasized acoustomology, or how we know, the epistemology of sound and how we know. My colleague Hildegard Westerkamp, who's extremely involved in acoustic ecology, environmental activism, basically acoustic sustainability and what musicians have to contribute to that. I have this is a link to an article that I wrote about that. I've already mentioned Bernie Krause's niche hypothesis that very briefly showed, these are some of the early diagrams, how on the frequency domain that certain species occupied certain frequency ranges. Just for instance, like radio broadcasts will occupy, simultaneous radio broadcasts will occupy their own frequency pattern. He discovered that often this was incredibly complex, and there were niches that even parts of the sound, so-called formants, would be in. And that has been extended. This is from his book, Great Animal Orchestra, that talks about that. And then my Italian colleague, David Monacchi, who's currently in Pesaro, has done work with Amazon and subtropical soundscapes. And he's introduced me, in fact, to this use of the spectrogram. It's called Spectra Foo. It's just a brand name. Don't ask me why a foo. And you'll see that when I start playing examples. Okay, that's just a brief overview of the larger picture. Let's go into now the more detailed. We've gone through Soundscape project, and I list various pieces here, but I'm going to jump down to these two documents. First of all, emphasizing the range of approaches that I've just been talking about, from found sound or phonography through to abstracted or possibly virtual types of imaginary soundscapes, which I have to say interest me a lot. Soundscape composition principles, I published this quite a few years ago, and everybody loves a list, not just students. And I heard Leopoldo going through the list here. So this may be the most quoted thing I've ever written, for better or worse. When I say principles now, I really don't mean that in a dogmatic, proscriptive way. It just, when I started this in the 90s of trying to look at this field of soundscape composition, what seemed to be the general characteristics. So it was very inductive type of thing. Let's look at practice by not only ourselves in Vancouver, but lots of other places. And are there some commonalities starting to emerge despite the incredibly wide uh, range of practices of sound artists of all kinds and stripes? There's, for instance, 23 interviews in a recent Oxford publication about environmental sound artists in their own words. And that was just a small subset of, and even though there are some common patterns, the actual practice is far from dogmatic or systematic in any way. However, these characteristics, so we've talked about listener recognizability of the source material. That is talking about how much do you process. In acousmatic music, you can start with a sound object and very easily totally turn it into something abstract that has no relationship to the original piece of paper that was crumpled or whatever. Nor does it need to, because it's not about crumpling paper. It's about sound shapes, spectromorphology. But we try to encourage the listeners to maintain some kind of recognizability. But then what if these sounds are not from, they've never experienced before? For instance, I'm going to play you an example from Copenhagen. Many of my students have never been to Europe, to a European train station. On the other hand, they recognize the commuting on our local SkyTrain, as it's called, our local transit, and they find that analogous. So it may be an analogous recognizability, but still it's a recognizability. And then that is not just recognizing, because that's what sound effects do, basically. We try to invoke the knowledge of the contextual knowledge, both the environmental, psychological, even political or economic or gender, all the real world knowledge that we have of how sounds are situated. Clearly, this is, from the composer's point of view, this is not how music composition has been traditionally taught, which is fine as long as you're only dealing with sounds related to each other. But once you start opening up to these real world influences, it's obviously tricky. We don't have too many models until recently. And so for practicing this yourself, well, the thing is, you start with your own knowledge of the environmental and psychological context. But the critical part is, can it influence the composition at every level, starting from micro going to macro? There's the big challenge. And we have, hopefully I'll give you a few examples that might spur your awareness of that. Also, from our originally work in the 1970s, we were very young and idealistic, thought of ourselves as kind of a bit radical. Schaefer assured us we were doing, quote, the world's most important work, which certainly got us going. And I think today the younger generation is also very concerned about environmental issues, and perhaps and many artists as well from various stripes, not just musical or acoustic, would like to think that perhaps they can make a contribution. I've already mentioned an article about acoustic sustainability. I want to get to examples now. One of the simple ways of classifying or seeing some organizational principles are derived from field recording and sound walking practice, and that is the spatial perspective of a recording. And could it be fixed, which emphasizes the flow of time, or be a discrete series of fixed perspectives? This would be like soundscape recording or monitoring, where you can move, but you can also just simply document the time flow of a particular series of events. These can be compressed in time. I've already mentioned the entrance to the harbor example, where it was compressed. And this actually does not seem like such a manipulation to most people, because that's not the way they remember events in the soundscape anyway. In fact, when a student goes out and records, it comes back and the typical thing is, oh, it doesn't sound like what I experienced. And there's a lot of different reasons, including the focusing of the microphone or the privileging of the microphone in one direction, but also it's the attention span. You focus, yes, when you're listening on different things, but it's not like making a recording of them because you discard uh, events or float portions of time in your memory. Uh, you compress the time in your own memory, and it's not in real time. So also there's media practice that does this all the time, you know, editing. We're so used to time compression, so it's not really clock time anymore. Narrative and oral history are very easy to integrate here. So we have a Vancouver Harbor ambience. This one is actually layered in stereo. So on the technical side, this sounds as if, I'll just play it in the background here for a bit. This sounds as if it was recorded this way. But in fact, we wanted for the Vancouver recording only 4 minutes. And what if our 4-minute recording didn't include that kind of boat horn, right? Or even worse, our old Canada horn sounds only at 12 o'clock, and that's part of the harbor. So could we only record before and after 12 o'clock? So in fact, and then if we go on, which I'm not going to, if we go on, we could hear some seaplanes. And what if your recording didn't have any seaplanes in it? How many seaplanes should be there? Well, when you are representing something in the short period, first of all, we could do a sound walk and discover what the normal kind of recording, presence of different sound that were characteristic. And then in this case, it's 4 stereo recordings were mixed into 2. And on the other hand, when you listen to it, people would say, yes, that seems to be reasonable. It has all of the typical harbor sounds. But if I started to put more and more seaplanes into it, because seaplane noise is a problem for the residents around the harbor, it's an annoyance. At a certain point, they would say, wait a minute, you're trying to make a point about that kind of noise, right? And you could do that if that was your purpose. Instead, I'm going to give an example from the Copenhagen train station. Actually, I think though it also has the journey aspect of it. So I think maybe I'll just wait a minute on that. Some of the other examples here we've already mentioned are the summer solstice found sound with or without time compression. The New Year's Eve had no time compression, and that 24-hour recording was compressed in the sense of 2 minutes of each hour recording were condensed into a 48-minute radiophonic, which of course is very useful because you could never possibly sit there for 24 hours and just listen. And so you would not feel or hear that macro rhythm of that particular moment of the bioacoustic cycle, midsummer, in the middle of various seasons, and changes over larger periods of time. It gives you an oral experience of something that you couldn't have otherwise. Poetry and narrativity can be added. Hildegard Westerkamp has been very good about running commentary. Her famous piece, Kit's Beach Soundwalk, or her very first composition back in the 70s, Whisper Study, when she used a text for that. I also have used some Shakespearean texts here, and there can also be oral history involved in. Transitions, I will, to just highlight Hildegard's work. She has some very innovative transitions in her Talking Rain piece, which is very much about the West Coast rainforest and particularly the area around the Point Atkinson that was in the where the foghorn was. But the rain perspectives in Talking Rain are very interesting, but she has even more interesting transitions between them. So that there's 2 fixed perspectives, and she's going from one to the other. Traditionally in the studio, you would use what's called a crossfade, but she does that, except that she puts a strikingly different sound, which is a car passing on rainy pavement, which would seem to be the opposite of this natural environment. After you hear the example, I'll tell you why it's not as irrational as it sounds. But it highlights going from, for instance, a higher density of rain to a lower density, for instance. So here are just two transitions, and I'll show you the spectrograph at the same time. And here's the second one. So notice how in each one of those cases, the dramatic transition of that signifying sound of the car passing or the truck passing then leads you to something that is much quieter, and it draws you into that new soundscape. Whereas if you had just cross-faded it, it would just sort of sound like maybe the rain was just dying off or something like that, right? And that transition signals you. Now, the irrational aspect of it is resolved, so to speak, in the piece, because 2/3 of the way through, she goes from these natural environments and suddenly plunks you into downtown Vancouver on a rainy day when those cars are passing. And so later she integrates the rain on the pavement, and that is, both of those sound like cars or trucks on a rainy pavement for that. So she, but in the very end of the piece, she goes back to the natural environment, shall we say. The moving perspective is basically modeled on the sound walk. I'm sure you've heard about this, or maybe you've already done one. There are wonderful ways to just have a listening walk that particularly even in an area that you're already familiar with. In fact, it might even be better in an area you're familiar with, because normally that familiarity means you don't pay much attention, except maybe to avoid a car that's coming past or something like that, to look out for danger. So the listening walk is the sound walk is a central methodology in soundscape awareness, because it always works for every kind of person and situation. It can be organized, led, scored, improvised. You can just do it on your own in a group. You can have a discussion afterwards or whatever. But it's basically a smoothly connected space-time flow. And like everything in the way we learn about soundscapes is often associated with moving through them. In fact, everything in cognition, if you change something, you learn something about it. Just as in the studio, when we modify a sound, we really understand the sound better through the manipulation of it. Or like a child, manipulating basic objects or things in the Piaget kind of sense. This kind of movement, and of course, acoustic space is constantly changing. And when we change our orientation to it, then we also become aware of this smooth transitions between various spaces. And when I say acoustic space, I mean not the visual space or the geographic space, but the space created by the sound. To me, acoustic space is created by the sound. And so sound events. And sound events, of course, can be quite unpredictable. So I've mentioned this classic entrance to the harbor case, and some others which use the technical, what's called parallel circuit crossfade. But I'm going to not talk so much about the techniques involved here, but go back to this Copenhagen piece called Pendlerodrome, because in 1996, this was the first time that I had a chance to do an 8-channel soundscape composition. technically that Vancouver Soundscape this in the same year, 96, that I mentioned, um, uh, the Sabina Breitsemeter and Hans Werner, they had technically done those pieces in 8-channel. So in the mid 1990s, we were experimenting with 8-channel and computer control over that. So I'm going to switch now to my documentation page, which over the last 10, 15 years, I've been putting detailed documentation of pieces that span now about a 40-year period, right down to the most recent. So this, of course, is pretty jaw-dropping for composers to see, because they usually just document the final product and not how everything was done. So this is something that I originally started for teaching purposes, to do this kind of detailed documentation, and of course it can benefit musicologists or analysis. And if I just use parts of it, I can also use it in lectures like this, in webinars. So I'm going to go back to this Pendlerdrom piece. This was commissioned from Copenhagen, an amazing commission of 12 composers to commission pieces on the subject of commuting by a Danish group called Scrape. And they sent me 1 hour of beautifully recorded material from Copenhagen train station, the central station, and on the commuter train, linking it to the suburbs. So this material was so wonderful, and even though they wanted a stereo piece, I was starting with an 8-channel system in my home studio right here. I live within an 8-channel, a nice 8-channel environment. Nowadays, that's not as rare as you might think, with small near-field speakers and things like that. And it does make a huge difference. So in the initial central station, this was by today's standard, my standards today, this is just an 8-track digital mix, right, down to stereo or in 8. And so I was just multi-tracking various recordings. So the opening, which I won't play, just basically situates you in the busy station, right? And so these were all stereo recordings, but when they were overlaid, it just made the impression of the station a little bit busier than it was. And there were some very simple spatializations. For instance, the public address announcements were doubled because they might come from different directions. So it got more interesting in the next part, which maybe I should just play it and not, and then maybe discuss some of the materials. The abstraction here is that the scenes 1, 3, and 5 are totally phonographic, totally natural, except for this overlay of events. And then you smoothly transition into what we would call a daydream. And in Danish, pendler means commuter, and drom means like traum, means a dream of some kind. So I'm interpreting this as a reality that everyone experiences in commuting, which is it's a familiar path, and you just simply space out as you move along, as you're waiting rather, or moving along on the train. So the idea was then to create a smooth transition where we're moving towards process sounds. So here we are waiting for the train, and the local train, that is, in this busy station. And there's a passing train that is going through. And by looping that and processing that, you're lulled into a kind of a drone, a daydream. I'm just going to fade that out here. There, of course, in the next section, we have to get out of the dream and back to reality. And so there's when the local train arrives, then that's the next section. And then once you're on the local train, then you quickly fall into a second daydream where little bits of the PA announcements and the whistles and things kind of loop back around your mind, so-called waterfall effect or flashbacks, or the Ohrwurm. I love your German name for it, the little Ohrwurms that like run around in your head. And then at the end, there's a big crash as they announce your station. It's actually the doors slamming on the train, but I've enhanced it enormously with granular synthesis and resonance. And then you're suddenly woken up, and then you get out and you're back home. So this has been a very popular piece in 8 channels for to introduce the ideas of soundscape composition. So notice that we're not just evoking the physical reality of being in these spaces, but also the psychological reality, a very simple one of going into an internal daydream. And that also justifies processing. Okay, I'm going to, in the interest of time, since we're quite limited here, I'm going to jump to now a completely imaginary soundscape. So basically the other end of the continuum. Chalice Well in 2009 is inspired by the sacred site in Glastonbury in the southwest of England, in Cornwall, which is millennia old in terms of legends about the Grail. But for instance, the well itself, this is just the modern cover over the well on the current site. There's actually no sound that you can hear when you're actually there, but it is inspiring still, the aura of it. But it's absolutely chock full of legends, including one that, one is that the well, which has never run dry in millennia, is where Joseph of Arimathea buried the Holy Grail to protect us from the underworld. But the related myth is that there are caverns underneath the well. They've never been discovered, which actually is great because then I can conjure them up. Historians say, oh, well, the monks invented these legends to attract tourists. And frankly, it hasn't changed too much since then. But I did like the symbolism of it. And so I imagined a journey, a sound walk, as it were, into an imaginary series of caverns, and then encountering the Grail and the underworld, and eventually being resolved. So a very loose kind of narrative. And the technique is now, I can't give you the entire idea about it, but there's a technique called convolution, which is usually used for creating natural reverberation. In other words, you would go into a space and clap or break a balloon, and that would be called the impulse response. You would hear, just as you would to hear the echo or whatever, you'd make a short broadband sound and then listen to the decay afterwards. Now, when you convolve, and that is the word in English, not convolute, when you convolve that sound with a dry sound, say in the studio, the sound appears to be in that space. And so that's a standard technique called impulse reverb. I don't have time to illustrate that, but basically it helps to explain why this material works the way it does. So for instance, if we take sounds that David Menaki recorded in a well, and you can hear the resonance there, and we convolve this with, for instance, granular synthesis. Actually, it was used in my piece River Run. So these are just synthesized, so there's no space whatsoever. And you convolve those two, you get you place those sounds in that space because of the impulse response nature of it. And so it takes off all those hard edges and makes it into a texture, right? That's very environmental. So the whole piece has many of these hybrids. And so everything in these different streams here, on this table, these sources on the vertical and the horizontal are convolved with each other, including some text. I'm going to skip over the text, although I'll just mention, since it will come up in the excerpt of the piece, that it is a female voice. When convolved, well, actually, I'll play you a little bit. When convolved with the text, you just hear the female formants. And why female? Well, because the well has been traditionally gendered as feminine. So you'll hear that in, oh, here's my local sound mark, by the way, marking noon. And if you hear it in the background, we have an industrial siren that's there. I'm just going to play examples now of hybrids that are not just the synthesis, but other sounds. For instance, here is a very banal domestic water stream, the kind of sound I tell my students, it's very dangerous to use these. Don't use this kind of domestic sound. You never know how the effect it's going to have on people. Okay, get it? Okay, when you put that into with the well, for instance, again, it softens the edges. And also what you will hear, there's something called the glass chamber, that if we convolve it with some glass breaking sounds, we can get glassy water sounds. Okay, so you can see that these have their hard edge of realism, you might say, softened. I think they can become much more symbolic. They can evoke not only spaces, but also imagery. So here is the second section of the piece called the Chamber of the Feminine that eventually will lead to the glass chamber. And again, if you wanted to look at all the details for the 8-channel, you can see that these are groups of 8-channel blocks that are being created. So it looks, 32 channels looks like a lot, but it's really just 4 8-channel versions. But just on a technical level, each channel is a kind of family member of the others, so that they are all creating a surround environment. So that's all in the documentation. So here is the stereo mix of the 8-channel piece. I hope someday to come to Cologne and present it live in 8. And then just a little bit of the glass chamber. Okay, that's just to intrigue you, hopefully, by something that is a completely imaginary space, and basically the micro level, this convolution works at the time frequency domain. Uh, if the technical description of it is that when you convolve two spectra, two sounds rather, two sounds, two waveforms, you multiply their spectra, which is exactly what happens when my voice is being modified by the acoustics of this room, right? That if it's a bright room, then you hear more high frequencies, and if it's a boomy room, you hear more lows, for instance. But we've never done it with convolving with itself or convolving two different sounds together, but it opens up at this micro level of the time frequency domain the possibility of hybridization and extensions that still are based in the kind of reverberation basis. I might give you just a couple of brief, since we're running out of time here, brief examples. For instance, of the convolution, I haven't given you an example of convolving the sound with itself. In Earth and Steel, this is about shipbuilding. It uses a World Soundscape Project recording of a medium-sized ship, but it was designed for a performance in the dockyards in Kent, where all the old where the ships were docked and repaired is now a museum, and this mezzanine area, and there was a wonderful 8-channel, or well, 32-channel concert really, or whatever, in that area that I did a piece for. So I just want to show you the effect of convolution with itself. So the basic sound of hitting the metal when convolved with itself prolongs the frequencies, prolongs the duration by a factor of 2 and thins it out to the most prominent frequencies. So I'm going to go back and do it again so that we have the original, the first auto convolution with itself, doubling it, and then doubling it again, and then doubling it again, and each one thinning out the spectrum. So when these are all combined, as they are in the 8-channel version, then it's like you are putting it into an abstracted kind of space, particularly as you start removing the original and just have this kind of memory, as it were, of a sound that's all been muted and extended and thinned out in terms of the spectrum. Yeah, that's just a brief example. I'm not going to try to play the piece itself. I would like to then, because we're going back and forth between the more documentary and the more abstracted, the most phonographic piece I think I've ever done is the Bells of Salzburg. I was invited to attend their 60th anniversary of the studio there. And of course, the World Soundscape Project had visited there in 1975 and recorded the fabulous bells from not only the main cathedral, which is this one, but also the many, many other churches that are around. And those 1975 recordings were ones that I'd already used them in a piece called The Blind Man back in the 70s, and it was good to come back to that. The square in front here is, of course, where the processions happen, and the bells that are the 7 bells, the entire set are only rung on high feast days, including Salvator Mundi, 14,000 kilogram bell that occupies just one of those towers. Of course, over the course of the war years, most of the bells were seized for armaments, and in 1961, 5 of them were recast, including the huge Salvator Mundi. So the piece itself then takes these 1975 recordings, and finally I got to go back in 2018 and actually visit this place that I had been hearing about for so long, and it being very historical, nothing too much I think had changed. And so the processing of these was to deal with not only the bells, for instance, that could be convolved with themselves, but also, for instance, the choir. Or even the Salvator Mundi itself. So the piece itself, we'll just hear a little bit of it. Of course, the big climax, which really you have to hear in 8 channels, is the full peal where all 7 bells are going. But the processing of it, even it is not just simply this prolonging, but the relationship of that to walking through these narrow streets with cobblestone and in the piazzas or in the squares, and all of the sound is reflecting around and creating what acousticians call a diffuse sound field, right? So the sound seems to come from everywhere, and it's absolutely overpowering, and it's wonderful to actually be there. You feel like you're swimming in these sounds. So I use that in the 8 channel with our computer controlled diffusion, which I don't have time to explain, but here is like a model of the virtual mixer that is processing them with delays. The second potentiometer here is being set to 170 milliseconds. So that's like a reflection coming from the neighboring, and then it goes around and around and around, and it creates this embedded quality. However, I think even in stereo, it'll give you a little sense of it. Here is the midday section. The whole piece goes from 7 a.m. till midnight, and that's why I call it a more phonographic type of piece. And here is just one section that has both the realism of the walking through towards the square, the cathedral square, and then hearing some of the bells. of course, you have to imagine yourself just being surrounded by all of that and it all swirling around you, which is actually just a bit of an abstraction for what you actually feel in those enclosed spaces. Okay, just to finish up, because it's very arbitrary, I'd like just to play you a little bit of the more recent piece. Basically, it's my, I think people are calling it your COVID isolation piece, a piece that I did last year that even though it's about the rainforest and the West Coast rainforest and the ravens that are wonderfully heard there, it was also on an emotional level, it's a sound walk not just through the forest, but through the whole trajectory that we're going through as a culture. It goes from highly joyous and open-ended in the beginning with these dripping water and the raven and the water resonated, and then being convolved with some wind chimes that give a certain pitch, and then the raven that has been kind of the guide through all of this is taking us into a much darker place that seems very oppressive. On the computer speakers, if you're just listening on computer speakers, if we get to that section, which we probably won't, you need a lot of bass because if you only hear it on a computer speaker, you're not getting the oppressive quality of the darkness that goes through. And since I guess I'm still an optimist at the end, a new day dawns and you suddenly emerge into a beautifully natural soundscape is some kind of hopeful return to so-called normality. The original Raven recording was one of those high sensory moments for me. I'll just play you, I won't play you the original because it's hard to pick up over, but I did enhance it a little bit, equalizing it and repeating the Raven flying right overhead and having the slow wings. So if you listen carefully, you can hear the wings here because I've tried to bring them out. And then when that is processed with the autoconvolution, you increasingly start moving away from that. Or then with transpositions. I'll just play you one example of then what is prolonged over several minutes is these lovely dripping water sounds that then get resonated and eventually move to be very joyously combined with the pitches of wind chimes. Okay, I have a feeling that we better wrap this up. It has been great sharing this with you. The whole piece is available on my website, but also on all my pieces in stereo are available on sonus.ca, sonus.ca. In fact, it was kind of featured there last December, and I was very happy with that people who are going through this trajectory might find this piece beneficial. So just to wrap this up, I'm going to return to the beginning here of I've tried to show some ways in which the outer complexity of the world can be evoked by sound, and through contemporary digital processing at the micro level, there can be a kind of synergy between this inner and outer complexity that allows you to experience and hopefully draw you more into listening and environmental sound directly. If you are wanting to follow up, then here is my email, truax@sfu.ca. Make sure it's UAX@sfu.ca. The other ones you don't need to make a note of, because if you want the WSP database guest password, you just send me an email and then you can just copy and paste that into your own browsers.